Today is finally the day. Jurassic World Rebirth officially hits theaters. I will be going to see it later tonight, and I do plan on making videos on that. But for now, for today, I decided to take all of the dinosaurs of the Jurassic Park / World videos and put them together into one large video. So basically, this is a huge video that you can sit back and relax to and just learn some really cool things about dinosaurs and just kind of like, listen about their depictions in the Jurassic franchise. So yeah, I hope you do enjoy the video, and I'm really hoping that Jurassic World Rebirth is awesome. Now, the first dinosaur that we see in complete daylight with a full shot of it is the Brachiosaurus. And man, is it magnificent. I love this scene. This is one of my favorite movie scenes, period. Not just one of my favorite dinosaur scenes, it's just one of my favorite movie scenes. I have Laura here. I love that scene so much that I got the Hammond Collection Brachiosaurus, and we all named her Laura. But it's seriously amazing. It is a fantastic way to introduce the audience to dinosaurs, to this island of dinosaurs. You feel like you're getting introduced to this amazing sauropod along with the characters. Just the way that the cinematography is handled, with those tight shots that, where the Brachiosaurus can't even fit in the camera, to those wide shots where you get the humans for scale. It's all perfectly done, and the CGI still holds up today, at least in my own opinion, and the sounds are amazing, the music is amazing, everything about it is fantastic. Now, this is actually a pretty accurate portrayal of Brachiosaurus for the time, albeit a little bit oversized. It has that bump on its head, it's got the huge bulky body, this long neck that's decently beefy, as well as forelimbs that are actually a little bit higher than their hind limbs. All very good stuff. But is it accurate today? Kind of, yes, if you're looking at it as Giraffatitan. Now, it's very common to look at old depictions of Brachiosaurus and actually see Giraffatitan in them. And the reason for that is because they were actually based off of Giraffatitan. There's a decent history to this, but basically, Brachiosaurus was found very incomplete in North America. It didn't even have a skull. Later on, in Africa, another sauropod was discovered. Now, it was thought that the skeletons of these two animals looked similar enough for them to be members of the same genus, as in both species of Brachiosaurus. So the one in Africa was named Brachiosaurus bronchi, and the one in Africa was actually a little bit more complete than the one in North America. The one in Africa even had its skull present. And so, as a result, whenever anyone was reconstructing Brachiosaurus, they were basing it off of, at the time, the African species, until more analysis was eventually done on these skeletons, and a conclusion was reached that they were too skeletally different to be considered members of the same genus. And so the African species was given its own generic name known as Giraffatitan, completely separate from Brachiosaurus as a whole. Since then, we also do know what Brachiosaurus' skull really does look like, and one of the biggest tells is the fact that that bump on its head is not nearly as pronounced. Whereas the one in Jurassic Park, of course, it does have a more pronounced bump on its head, similar to how Giraffatitan was. So it's a great Giraffatitan portrayal, but it just doesn't match up to Brachiosaurus nowadays. Still, beautiful, one of the best movie scenes ever. That one was a little bit longer, but we don't have as much of a convoluted history for the other animals. So let's go straight on to Parasaurolophus, which has a brief little cameo right next to the Brachiosaurs as they're exiting the water. Again, it's very brief, and we only see them from a distance, so it's difficult to make out a lot of the details. But you can make out enough to get an idea of what their designs would have looked like. Now, they are completely quadrupedal, which seems to match up with our ideas nowadays that hadrosaurs are mostly quadrupedal animals that from time to time could switch to bipedal locomotion. So that's really good. They also do have their very iconic head crest, something that, of course, Parasaurolophus does sport. It's a very cool head crest. Something that possibly allowed them to amplify their sounds, as the crest is actually linked up to their nasal cavity. So it's something that they could likely blow air through and just create these large trumpeting noises. Very cool stuff, am I right? Probably the biggest difference between what I can see here and our modern ideas of the animal is the fact that they are pretty skinny. They're decently shrink-wrapped here, especially in the neck. Hadrosaurs nowadays are often portrayed as very beefy, especially in the neck. But at the time, it was very common for most people to portray hadrosaurs like this, being relatively thin. Just nowadays, there's a lot more meat on their bones. But I still love their portrayal here. I still think it looks really cool. Next up is Triceratops. Now, again, another amazing scene. I'm probably going to say that about every single scene. I just love this movie so much. But its scene is really great here. The animatronic is so good. I love the fact that the actors can actually interact with it. It's something that helps ground the scene and makes you feel like you're there. And just watching this poor sick Triceratops as it just kind of just lies there and breathes heavily and just it's so good. It's so good. It's such a good animatronic. I'm not the biggest fan of the Jurassic Park design for the animal. It's pretty accurate for the time, which most of these designs are going to be. There's this huge misconception nowadays that the Jurassic Park franchise was never accurate, which simply isn't true. Like the filmmakers and Stan Winston Studios and all the designers and everything, they went into production with the intention of having some accuracy. I mean, they even had paleontology consultants helping them. Now, that of course, they did take some creative liberties wherever they saw fit, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more as we continue. But for the most part, they were accurate, and the Triceratops is a good example of that. This is pretty much how most portrayals of Triceratops looked at the time. But its snout is a little bit more stubby, its head is probably a little bit too small compared to the real-life animal. Its tail is probably a little bit too long. I can't really confirm that in the movie, but like in Jurassic World Evolution and in Jurassic World later, like the later Jurassic World film, you can see the tail, and it is pretty long compared to how the real-life animals was. It also does have elephant feet, which is very common. It's very common for dinosaurs, like herbivorous dinosaurs, to be portrayed with elephant feet. They didn't have that. Ceratopsians had what were, they looked a lot more like reptile feet. Go figure. They were reptiles. While they were a little bit rounded, they weren't nearly this rounded. They basically had 3 toes that were facing out in the front and 2 toes that were vestigial hanging off the back. Very interesting and strange feet, but I don't know what you'd consider a normal foot. So good job, Triceratops. It also does have very pronounced epiccipitals, which are those little spikes on its frill. Epiccipitals, those are something that Triceratops did have. However, when it would age, they would start to fuse a little bit more to the frill and become more and more reduced, not nearly as sharp as it's portrayed right here. But one really cool thing about this one is that it does have the feature scales, which are those large pebble-like scales that are just randomly throughout the animal's body. Something that Triceratops did have, as we can see through some skin impressions. So it's very cool that it's included here. It also does have a beak. I haven't mentioned that yet. And the classic 3-horned face, which is very important for Triceratops. Amazing animatronic, just not a big fan of the design. And that's mainly just because I love ceratopsians. I love the way that they look. Next up is the biggest creative liberty that was taken, the Dilophosaurus. So first of all, there's some things that were done correctly about this animal, like the 2 crests. Dilophosaurus does translate to double-crested lizard, and that is because it has 2 crests situated on top of its head. Very cool that was included here, which I don't know why it wouldn't be. I also really like the way that the head looks, and I really like the way that the rest of the body looks. And the animatronic, of course, looks amazing. Now, there are some key differences that are present here. First of all, it is small. It's likely a juvenile. I think that most people who were involved with creating the Dilophosaurus completely had the intention of making this a juvenile. I think that Stan Winston Studios even full-on said it when they were making the animatronic. But what's frustrating about that is that the later films and Camp Cretaceous failed to confirm this. Every time we see Dilophosaurus after this point in time, it's always small. Why? Just give us a full-grown one. Just confirm that. Just like officially show it on screen. Because like, what are the odds that we're only coming across juveniles in the later films and shows? That's just frustrating to me. But of course, the main differences are the presence of the frill and the presence of the venom that it spits, the spitting acid venom sort of thing. Now, those are things that we can see in the fossils, of course. There's attachment points for the frill that are lacking on the real-life Dilophosaurus, and in order for it to store venom, it would need extra space in its skull. That's also something that is not present. So we know that Dilophosaurus was not a venomous dinosaur, nor did it have a frill. The frill's also very interesting too, because it kind of uses it like a threat display, with those bright colors. But at that point, it was already chasing Nedry, like it had the intention of eating him. Yet it was using a threat display. It's like, Nedry was trying to leave. Little Dilophosaurus, what are you doing here? Why are you doing that? Yeah, this fella is quite a bit different from its real-life counterpart, and it's also different from its movie counterpart, as the movie counterpart did not have a frill, it did spit venom, and it was also closer in size. I mean, we saw an adult in that one. Still a great animatronic that's breaking its wrists right here, but still very high quality. And yes, that is one of the moments where they took creative liberties, because this wasn't even accurate for the time. After that, we have the old chicken mimic, Gallimimus. Now we get a flock of them as they're running through. Another fantastic scene. They're huge. They're portrayed as huge, which is great because Gallimimus is the largest of the ornithomimids. Skeletally, they look great. Like their whole build, the way that they hold their head, the way that they move, just incredible. I also really like that you can see some younger fellas, and they have striping on them, which is just a little subtle detail that you probably wouldn't even notice, but when you do notice it, you kind of like sit there and go, oh, look at that. That means when the babies are young, they have something that helps them hide from predators a little bit easier, kind of like deer. I like that. I like little details like that. Of course, they are featherless. It is very common to see dinosaurs like this portrayed without feathers at this point in time, even though ornithomimids like Gallimimus did have feathers. But everything else is a really solid portrayal. Their head shape is great, and again, their whole body shape is fantastic. Then next up is the classic Tyrannosaurus Rex, old Rexy, or Roberta, depending on if you want to go through the animatronic name. Again, same things apply to this. Her scenes are amazing. Every single scene that she's in is just fantastic. The breakout scene, the scene where she hunts the Gallimimus flock, I like how she uses ambush predation to pull that off, jumping out of the tree line. And the final scene where she takes out the final two velociraptors. Spoiler alert. Both the animatronic and the CGI model are perfect. They go together seamlessly, even though there are some slight differences between the two. But they are so, like, a lot of the techniques that are used to blend them together to make them feel like they're just one T-Rex, it's just flawless, and I always love seeing it. Now, this is actually a fairly accurate depiction of Tyrannosaurs for the time, but of course doesn't really hold up by today's standards, mostly in the head. The head is a lot more blocky than how you would see most Tyrannosaurus depictions nowadays. She also does break her wrists every once in a while, but sometimes she does hold them the correct direction, palms facing inward, but sometimes she does curl them underneath her body, palms facing downward, so she's breaking her wrists, which that's not good. She's also portrayed without lips, which, it's always a debated topic, but it is very likely that theropod dinosaurs did have oral tissue, that being lips. But her bulk seems to be captured pretty well here, and the texturing of the skin actually looks pretty good as well. And it's easily one of my favorite T-Rex designs in all of media. Such an iconic design. Of course, there are different Rexes that I think look cooler and better than Rexy, but I'm not going to talk about those ones until we get into the later movies, if we do. But yeah, regardless, 10 out of 10. And finally, the Velociraptor. Now, I'm sure that most of you know that the Jurassic Park Velociraptor is actually Deinonychus. And the reason why that is because Michael Crichton, the author of the original novel, actually liked the idea that the North American Deinonychus and the Mongolian Velociraptor were actually both species of the same genus. That genus just being Velociraptor. That was something that Gregory S. Paul had proposed, and again, Michael Crichton liked that idea. If that were to be the case, that would rename Deinonychus anteropus to Velociraptor anteropus, and Velociraptor mongoliensis would stay the exact same. Michael Crichton liked that idea, and he thought that the name Velociraptor sounded better anyway, so basically what he did was he implemented Deinonychus into his book, and he just named them Velociraptor. Something that was then carried over to the movie. And these are actually far better Deinonychus portrayals than they are Velociraptor portrayals. Deinonychus was bigger than Velociraptor, not this big. Like, they're still huge in the movie. Like, they're actually closer to Utahraptor size, but they're not based off of Utahraptor because Utahraptor wasn't even officially described yet. So, yeah. And their skeleton matches up to Deinonychus way more. And if you need more proof, I have it for you. This book was released in 1990. That's a whole 3 years before the first Jurassic Park came out. This book has Deinonychus in it, and it looks like this. Look at that. That's basically a Jurassic Park Velociraptor portrayal, because they were based off of Deinonychus. And actually, that kind of shows how accurate for the time they were. They are portrayed without feathers, which again was very common for the time. Their wrists are breaking, and again, they're huge. Still, very cool. Very iconic designs, I love the kitchen scene. I love all of the techniques that were used in that. Again, the CGI models look great, mixed in with the sort of costume that you have. There's some people inside a costume just walking around with them, which looks really good. And they have a really cool scene at the end of the movie where, of course, they get attacked by Rexy. Spoilers. All around, very iconic portrayals, but very different to both Velociraptor and Deinonychus. And for a bonus, there's another dinosaur that appears in this movie, and that is the pelicans. These are the most accurate ones on screen. Very good job, Jurassic Park. You guys did it. Starting off with the Compsognathus that shows up at the very beginning of the film when, of course, a rich family, they end up on the island and, some compies are like, yeah, food. Anyway, I really like their movements here. There's a lot of emphasis on their bird-like nature, which is something that, is fair because there is a very clear link between birds and dinosaurs. I mean, obviously now we know that birds are actually dinosaurs, but back then there was even a lot of talk for how close birds truly are to dinosaurs. So I love seeing it represented in a dinosaur like Compsognathus that's very small and bird-like in nature. It has like an arrowhead-shaped snout, a slender build, it's overall very thin, and of course it's presented as naked. Now, there is a lot of discussion on whether or not Compsognathus did have feathers. Its close relative, Sinosauropteryx, did have them, but currently we don't have any evidence for Compsognathus. However, you will see a lot of artists depict them with feathers. Feathers are probably pretty likely for a dinosaur like this. This is probably decently accurate for the time, but of course it just doesn't hold up to our current understanding of these sorts of animals. However, I do like the fact that they are presented with lips, which, same with the velociraptors. It's interesting that some creatures have them and some don't. But that is a very good start to the list. Next up is the herd of Stegosaurus. These look awesome. There's so many awesome things about them. Their immense scale, the quality of the CGI, there's a lot of really good things about them. They are oversized by quite a bit. Like, these guys are quite huge, and there are some things about their anatomy that don't really hold up to our current understanding of the animal, like probably how huge their hips are or the placement of their head, as the attachment point for the vertebrae kind of attached to the back of the skull instead of being underneath the skull. But that aside, these are really good portrayal. They have their osteoderms, which are those plates on their back. They have the thagomizer, which are those two sets of spikes that they have on the end of their tail, and they actually hold their tails up in like more so a correct position, with the end of the tail starting to slope down a little bit because, of course, that thagomizer, that collection of spikes, are pretty heavy, so they would kind of like weigh the tail down a little bit. They just look awesome, and they have a very cool scene in the overall movie. There's also a baby Stegosaurus that has reduced proportions, smaller plates, and of course a stubbier face and things like that. The animatronic that they used for the baby Stegosaurus looks really good, and all things considered, all of this just looks awesome. A very cool and intense scene, and it's always really good to see herbivorous dinosaurs utilized in a way that isn't peaceful. That's something that happens a lot, where you have herbivorous dinosaurs and the characters are approaching it with the idea that, like, oh, they won't eat me, so they are safe, when in reality, of course, herbivores, a lot of times you have to be more careful around herbivores than you do predatory animals, because herbivores are often pretty aggressive animals. And I like seeing that these stegosaurs are aggressive animals, especially when you're like messing with one of their young. I think that's a very nice touch. After that, we have the Pachycephalosaurus, which actually doesn't look too far off from our modern understanding of the animal. I mean, the whole proportions of it seem to be pretty spot on. The shape of its skull seems to be there. It does have a beak too, and they actually portrayed it with cheeks, which there's a little bit of a debate on whether or not Pachycephalosaurus had cheeks. A lot of dinosaurs, there's a lot of agreement that they did, like hadrosaurs and things like that, but it's still not entirely agreed upon if dinosaurs like Pachycephalosaurus had them. I mean, in prehistoric planet, we see them portrayed without cheeks, which is, certainly an interesting portrayal. But it does have all of these little bumps all across its head and on its nasal portion, so it seems like a fairly solid depiction of Pachycephalosaurus, and I like the way that it's utilized. I like how it's another dinosaur that you kind of have to be a little bit careful around, despite the fact that it's a mostly herbivorous dinosaur. There is also some talk that Pachycephalosaurus was an omnivorous dinosaur due to the shape of some of its teeth, but that's of course not entirely known right now. But still, it's very cool to see Pachycephalosaurus portrayed in such a way. That whole stampede scene in general, just really good, really top-notch stuff, and we're going to be talking about a few creatures in that scene. So yeah, we'll just stay on that topic with the Gallimimus. Now, we already talked about the Gallimimus quite a bit in the first movie breakdown, and there's not much else I can say right here. It lacks its feathers. It has this really interesting sort of orange coloration, but the whole anatomy and the whole shape of it seems to match up pretty well. Yeah, there's really not much else I can add to it. It shows up briefly in a couple of scenes. But then there is the Parasaurolophus. Now, this is actually our best look that we get at Parasaurolophus in this franchise thus far, and it looks pretty dang good, especially for the time. This is a pretty accurate portrayal of Parasaurolophus for the time. I mentioned in the previous video, when we were talking about Parasaurolophus in there, that for the most part, hadrosaurs like Parasaurolophus were portrayed as relatively thin, especially in the neck. We now know, nowadays, that hadrosaurs like Parasaurolophus had pretty beefy necks, and just a pretty beefy build overall. They were these hefty herbivores that would have been a true sight for sore eyes. Aside from that, it does have a lot of things that you would expect from a Parasaurolophus portrayal. Like, you'll notice that it seems to have some tall neural spines that run down its back. That is something that hadrosaurs like Parasaurolophus did have, and because it's a little bit shrink-wrapped right here, you can really notice them. It does have its crest, something that Parasaurolophus is quite known for. It has a beak, it's portrayed with cheeks as well, and of course it's probably able to switch from a bipedal to a quadrupedal stance, especially going off of the first film, and it gets down pretty low in this film. It's also huge. It's portrayed as being huge, which is pretty true because hadrosaurs, again, they were these hefty, huge animals. At least a huge portion of them were. And Parasaurolophus was no exception. It was a big dinosaur. I also really like its sounds. They kind of sound like these loud trumpeting noises, which does have some basis in accuracy because Parasaurolophus is one of the few dinosaurs that we have a good idea to what it sounded like when it was alive. Now, of course, it's not perfect, but a team of scientists did like recreate a Parasaurolophus head. And I mentioned in the last video that the crest is actually hollow and it links up with the nasal cavity, which implies that they would be able to blow air through there to produce these loud noises. A team of researchers recreated this whole structure right here, and they sent air through it to produce a noise, and it was this loud trumpeting noise that kind of sounded like a ship horn. Now, obviously, that's probably not a perfect system, but that's really as close as we can get to any dinosaur vocalization, or at least extinct dinosaur. Like, we know what birds sound like, of course, because I mean, the ones that live today, we know what they sound like. And this isn't really too far off from that. It does sound like the type of trumpeting, honking noises that you would probably expect from Parasaurolophus, so they're kind of ahead of their time right here. It's a very nice portrayal, and I love the quality of the CGI, and I love how difficult it was for everybody to try to take it down, Herbivores ain't no pushovers. You heard? I heard. After that is Mamenchisaurus, our second sauropod in the franchise overall. I like how it's distinct from Brachiosaurus. It has a thinner neck, a smaller head, and a longer tail and things like that. It's a pretty decent portrayal for, how quickly it shows, like it comes and goes. It is probably a little bit thin compared to the way that the real life animal would have been, but it's still a very fun portrayal, and I do love when they introduce some lesser known dinosaurs to like the screen, even if it is very brief. Then we have Triceratops, one of the many dinosaurs to break out of the little camp that they had set up. A lot of the same things apply to this one that we already saw in the first Jurassic Park. The shape of the frill seems consistent, and its overall body shape seems to be relatively consistent. I will say that it does seem like its tail is relatively short here, which is in huge, like, stark contrast to the way that's portrayed in Jurassic World and in a lot of the games. So, in a way, I think this one's a little bit more accurate than those ones. Still not a big fan of the way that the face looks or the frill, but it is still a pretty decent portrayal. And again, it's nice to see some herbivores, like, doing something more than just being peaceful carnivore meat. I haven't realized until I'm doing this list how many times that happens in Lost World. Maybe that's one of the reasons why I like this movie so much. They portray, like, the herbivores, they feel like actual animals more so than, something to be stared at for, to show that, oh, dinosaurs are so cool creatures, like, oh, and then just get killed by a carnivore. That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. I quite like that. We also get a brief look at a baby Triceratops, and it looks consistent to the ones that we're about to get in Jurassic World Evolution. So yeah. You got these stubbier proportions with smaller and reduced horns. Not overall too accurate, but still it's pretty close to what baby Triceratops was like in the wild. Then we're getting into Tyrannosaurus Rex territory. So there's the buck, the doe, and Junior. We'll start off with the buck. The buck is probably one of my favorite T-Rexes in the whole franchise, and that mainly stems from his design. He has this really cool green coloration with pronounced eyebrow ridges and a more pronounced nasal ridge. It's very cool and subtle details that I just absolutely appreciate, and it all just looks really cool, especially with the striping that he has. The doe is a little bit more reminiscent to the way that Rexy was, with more so a brown coloration mixed in with some other colors too, which is also something that I love because that was like some consistency that they were having. It felt like with these earlier movies, they were trying to put some sense behind some of the portrayals that they had. Like, yeah, the females, they're a little bit more brown in coloration, whereas the males, they are a little bit more green in coloration. And Junior, he sports that sort of green coloration that his father has, which implies that he would grow into that. I liked that consistency that they had with it. And, nowadays they don't do that too much. There's a lot more like for example, in Camp Cretaceous, we got Big Edie, who is a female T-Rex, and she's blue, which is very different from the way that Rexy and the doe were. Which, of course, that was probably produced by a different company, and they probably did their own thing to it. But I liked the implication that this is how these animals would have been in the wild. And it really got you thinking. It's like, there's a little bit more layers to these animals, and they have their own social structures. That's something that I really appreciated about those earlier movies, and it's something we got a little bit more of as especially into the third film. In the third film, there's quite a bit of sexual dimorphism, and so, we'll talk about that more when we get into that. but it's something that I thought was really cool. But yeah, the T-Rex family, they're really cool. They're really cool. Their animatronics are amazing. Their CGI models are amazing. Junior, his whole practical effect is awesome as well. And I like how he looks like a juvenile baby T-Rex in this universe, of course. Very distinct from how we would likely expect T-Rex to look nowadays, with a more slender snout and things like that. He's got more so like a blocky snout compared to his parents, which again, that makes sense in universe. Just very well done across the board with those. And again, I really like the implication that there's a lot of sexual dimorphism going on with these fellas. Then after that, we have the velociraptors. Now they've stepped away from the sort of brown coloration that we saw in the first film, and they gave them tiger stripes, which is very cool. Like, they look awesome. We don't get to see it too well because it's in the darkness for the most part, but you know, especially some of the close-up shots that you can see, it's very pleasing for the eye. You know, you got some nice orange coloration with counter shading of white and some black striping. It looks great. There's also a little bit of sexual dimorphism that happens with them. Like, there's slight differences in the colors between the males and females, but nothing as dramatic as in Jurassic Park 3, which again, we'll talk about that a little bit more when I get to that one. They still look great though. You know, pretty much everything I've said about the first one applies to this, and the fact that they're mostly Deinonychus. Well, actually, they are Deinonychus, technically speaking. Just, you know, a little bit stylized in a few different ways, and they are fairly accurate for the time. Just a little bit less accurate the further we get into the 90s and getting into the 2000s. They still look great though, and I really like the tall grass scene. Of course, I made a whole video ranking the tall, like how each Jurassic film used the tall grass, and of course, this scene was number one. It's a fantastic scene, and the portrayals of the raptors are all also really good. And then finally, we have our first appearance of a flying reptile, if you exclude birds, because birds are flying reptiles, but our first non-dinosaur flying reptile, the pterosaur, the pteranodon that we see at the very end of the film, where, you know, it lands on a branch, screeches, and then the screen fades to black. It's the final creature that we see in the movie, and it was a pretty cool addition. And I like its design here. I love the way that it's sort of silhouetted against the sunlight. Makes it seem a lot more detailed, especially with the light shining through the membrane of its wings and everything. It's a fairly thin design, and of course it does lack things like pycnofibers, or feathers, you know, those are basically feathers, but whatever, fight me on it. But they still look really, it still looks really good, and it still very much looks for its time. This is likely Pteranodon longiceps, which is one of the two species that we know of, because its crest doesn't nearly seem as broad as on Pteranodon sternbergi. But just a fantastic portrayal, and it would have been cool to see more of it, but, you know, it's completely fine that we didn't. It's a very nice, like, final shot that certainly does stick with you after you watch the movie. So the first creature we'll talk about is Triceratops. We see it right here. It has sort of like a green coloration, which is something I dig. You can also see that it has some stripes right there from like the aerial view. There's also some Stegosaurus here. I'm not going to focus about the Stegosaurus specifically because it kind of has the same overall idea that it did in the Lost World. So, you know, we'll pretty much just leave it at that. The Stegosaurus looks pretty dang good. But one thing that stands out to me with the Triceratops is this right here. Doesn't this model look a little bit disproportionate? It's got like a huge body. The tail seems pretty good, and actually the snout seems better overall, and the size of the frill too, but I don't know, there's just something about the way that its body looks that's just so interesting. You could tell that it was mostly meant to be like a background dinosaur rather than being something that was, you know, front and center. But it's a pretty fun start to the list, I think. After that is the Parasaurolophus. Now, it basically has the same model from The Lost World. However, this time it's green, and it looks pretty dang good. It looks like it's suited for jungle life, and I quite like it. Everything else that I said about The Lost World Jurassic Park Parasaurolophus still applies to this, and the fact that it's thin, and yeah, mostly that it's thin. However, I was going through some of these shots of the herd, and there's actually some young Parasaurolophus that actually have a reduced crest. That's awesome. I love that. I love seeing stuff like that. Good job. And then the first and only time we ever see Corythosaurus is also in this herd. Now, that's something I love. I love seeing like herds of like a mixture of different animals. You know, it's really cool to see that today with wildebeest and zebras and things like that. So I love seeing it with extinct creatures, like, you know, just seeing Corythosaurs hanging out with Parasaurolophus. I really like the Corythosaurus design. It's a shame that we don't really see it anymore in the franchise, because it has most of everything you'd expect from a Corythosaurus, aside from the fact that, like the Parasaurolophus, it is still too thin. But it has that crest that you'd expect. The shape of the head looks pretty good. And, you know, it's able to go from bipedal and quadrupedal locomotion, much like any other hadrosaur would. The colors are also a huge standout with these yellows and the sort of brownish coloration like on the counter shading. It looks really good, and also how bright that crest is. So it's a fantastic design that I would love to see more of. And again, it's unfortunate that we haven't seen more of it later in the franchise. After that is the Brachiosaurus that has a redesign. Like this is completely different from the first Jurassic Park film. It doesn't sport a singular, like, sort of gray coloration. Rather, you actually get a green coloration, which that's kind of consistent. A lot of these animals are sporting a green coloration, even though stegosauruses in the background kind of have a green coloration. But it has that green coloration with some really cool looking patterns, as well as a head that is a little bit more red. That also rhymes. Good. It seems like that is an example of sexual dimorphism in the movie, as some of them have a red head and others do not. So you could probably assume that the ones with the red head are males and the ones that don't are females, which is a cool little detail. I didn't mention this for the Jurassic Park portion, but notice how high those nostrils are. That's actually an outdated thing. The consensus seems to be that the nostrils were a lot lower on the animal's snout and not nearly that high up close to the top of the head. Now, the openings, their nares, those are on like their head, but that doesn't mean that's where the nostrils would have sat. Rather, they would have sat a lot closer to the mouth. You know, that certainly makes a lot more sense overall. But I really do like these Brachiosaurus designs. I love seeing some color placed onto them. And the boat scene where they're moving past them just looks really cool. Compsognathus makes a brief little appearance. Basically the same things that I said about its appearance in The Lost World applies to this. The Ankylosaurus. This is the best that Ankylosaurus has ever looked in this franchise. It has like, I mean, the model overall is a little bit outdated. Like, it looks like its armor piece on the back is one solid thing, when in reality, Ankylosaurus just had like these little individual osteoderms that were scattered throughout the whole body. It wasn't just like a solid shell type thing. But that aside, the whole skeletal structure looks pretty decent. It does have its club at the end of its tail, and the colors are a true standout. I love the red on the face and the white underbelly with the darker coloration on top. It just looks really good in my mind, and it's a real shame that we haven't really seen these colors since then. Like, you know, we go on to later movies and they kind of sport duller coloration. I vote that we go back to this coloration because it looks great. Next up is the one and only Tyrannosaurus Rex that makes an appearance in this movie. Much like the buck, it does sport a green coloration, and it does have more pronounced eyebrow ridges, which suggests that this is a male Tyrannosaur, which of course is kind of confirmed by its name, which is Bull. I know that there's a lot of people who think that this is Junior from The Lost World, but as it currently stands, that is an unconfirmed fan theory, and it's pretty unlikely that it is Junior. It's most likely that this is just a new T-Rex that they made, one that can be absolutely decimated by the Spinosaurus. Its animatronic looks great though, and green coloration on T-Rex is always really cool in this franchise, especially with those pronounced eyebrow ridges. I just love it. Next up is the Pteranodon, and the Pteranodons are an interesting one. I love the way that they look. I love the whole shape of their head. You know, they got the crest on the back, and the way that their beak looks really good, and I love the way that their bodies look as well, and the practical effects look amazing. Their coloration is also amazing. One thing that bugs me though is the fact that they have teeth. One of the biggest reasons why that bugs me is, well, of course, because Pteranodon did not have teeth, but also the name Pteranodon translates to toothless wing. It was named that because it didn't have teeth. And these guys have teeth. It's just a fun little observation that I've always had. But, you know, I like the way that they look regardless. I love the way that their eyes look, especially when they're peering at you. It's just so terrifying. A little bit unfortunate that they are naked. You know, they don't they don't have any like small amounts of fuzz, which I think was a later thing that would be applied. So not the fault of the film, but all around, very cool and very classic Pteranodon depiction. Like, this looks like very classic Hollywood. Next up is the Velociraptors. This is the best that the Velociraptors have ever looked. These are by far my favorite designs of these ever. You know, they look great. The shape of their skull has actually been thinned a little bit more, which is a lot more reminiscent with both Deinonychus and Velociraptor. But of course, the biggest standout, like with many of these creatures, are the colors. The males look amazing with their coloration. It's sort of like a bluish purplish coloration with a white stripe and like a red crest, which they didn't have that crest, by the way, but you know. Not to mention the quills, which was a step in the direction towards feathers, I suppose, in these designs. they look so good. And the female looks awesome too. And I just love that there's sexual dimorphism between them as well. The female looks a little bit more reminiscent to the previous Jurassic Park raptors that we've seen in the fact that she lacks the quills, and her coloration, I mean, her coloration still looks amazing as well. You have like sort of a base coloration of white with some black spots, and the way that she just stares at you with her eyes, terrifying. They killed it with the velociraptors in this movie, and I'm so glad that Rebirth seems to be taking this route in terms of their velociraptor portrayals. We also have the very brief cameo from the Ceratosaurus. Now, I'll say this, that I'm not really the biggest fan of the way that this Ceratosaurus looks. Overall, its skull is a little bit too rounded, too bulky, I suppose. It also has like a singular horn rather than a structure that looks more like a crest on its nose. And it also does lack its lacrimal crests, which are things that are present on the real life animal. Ceratosaurus is one of my favorite dinosaurs, so those are things I love to see on the animal, and those are just things that are lacking in this model. I have heard some people say that this is simply just a tweaked T-Rex model, which certainly does explain some of the design elements like the shape of the skull and whatnot, but yeah, it's probably one of my least favorites, but it's only briefly in the film. Colors are cool though. The red coloration with the black stripes, that's awesome. I like that. And finally, the big one, the Spinosaurus. This is where the animal became a household name. This is where everybody learned about it. It made its big cinematic debut by completely demolishing the largest predatory animal to ever exist, the Tyrannosaurus Rex, the predatory land animal, of course, and it stole the hearts of many. Of course, when I watched this, I was 5 years old. That's when I first saw this movie. Before that, my favorite dinosaur was T-Rex, like most kids. Most kids, they do have T-Rex as their favorite. But when I saw this movie and I saw the Spinosaurus defeat the T-Rex, I was like, that's my new favorite. And then it became my new favorite. Nowadays, that's not why it's my favorite now, because nowadays, there's Spinosaurus, it was more so an animal rather than a movie monster, but it's still my favorite nowadays just because of how fascinating it is. But this design is still absolutely amazing. I just got the Hammond Collection Spinosaurus. It's up there. You can barely kind of see it. There you go, right next to the Rebirth Spinosaurus. I love that thing so much. This is an iconic design that was fairly accurate for the time. At the time, in the early 2000s, late 90s, Spinosaurus was thought to be basically just a large baryonyx with a sail on its back, and that's what this is. Now, there are things that don't match up for the time, the biggest being the snout. The snout is a baryonyx snout, and we did have the snout of Spinosaurus at the time, so that is an inaccuracy for the time. But regardless, still looks amazing. It's got those huge and powerful arms. It's got the sail with really cool blue patterns in it, and the sounds that it makes, those roars, just chef's kiss. It's amazing. I've been saying this a lot these last few days, but it's easily my favorite fictional Spinosaurus out there. Like, it's so cool. The coloration is incredible. The animatronic is incredible, which, by the way, the animatronic is the largest animatronic that was made for a film, which is amazing. It actually destroyed the T-Rex animatronic. There were going to be some scenes where the animatronics were fighting each other, because in the movie, it ended up being just the CGI models fighting each other. But if you look at some behind the scenes things, you'll notice there's some shots of like the claw hitting the T-Rex and whatnot. Those never made it into the final film. And I'd assume one of the biggest reasons why that happened is because the Spinosaurus animatronic actually broke the T-Rex animatronic. So on set, the Spinosaurus actually won the fight. Both on set and in the movie, which is just so funny to me. Okay, so the first dinosaur that we get to see in the whole movie is probably the most accurate in the whole movie, in the whole trilogy, really. That is the bird at the beginning of the movie. We get to see its foot go down, and it's obviously a theropod foot, and then we get to see the whole bird, and it's CGI, so they had to like model it, and it's the most accurate one that we've seen probably ever. Beautiful, just beautiful work done right there. After that is the Mosasaurus. Now, the Mosasaurus is a cool one. This is the first time that a marine reptile, like, officially canonically makes its debut in the Jurassic franchise. Of course, there was basically the Tylosaurus in the Jurassic Park, the game, but of course, most elements of that game are not really canon, and if anything, most of it's like soft canon by this point. This is the first on-screen marine reptile, and it honestly looks pretty good. Of course, it's oversized, but the whole general shape certainly does match up to a Mosasaurus. The only thing that really bugs me about it is the fact that it is covered in osteoderms, which That's something that mosasaurs did not have. Mosasaurs were giant marine lizards, and they had an overall smooth skin texture. This is, of course, something that makes it seem more like a crocodilian, which is I don't think that's really a comparison that we really need to make because of how distinct they are. I mean, like crocodilians, like crocodiles, modern day crocodiles, those are archosaurs. Mosasaurs are not even archosaurs. They're a completely different type of reptile entirely. And I know there's going to be a lot of people who say, oh, it's probably just filled in with crocodilian DNA. I don't care. It's still a movie design. They can design it however they want. And that's just the one thing. I just don't like that about it. But again, the mouth looks pretty good. It's got a lot of teeth. It even has the pterygoid teeth, which are the small teeth on the roof of its mouth, which is something that I really like to see. Overall, I think it's a very good mosasaur design. Next up are the stegosaurs, and this is where we start to get gray. One of the biggest critiques that many people have with the Jurassic World movies, myself included, is that a lot of the movie designs are kind of gray. There's not a lot of color placed into them. They're pretty boring and dull in comparison to what came before. The Stegosaurus is a good example of that. Of course, it is just a background dinosaur in this movie, but even compared to how it was in Jurassic Park 3, it lacks a lot of the coloration that really makes it feel like an actual animal. It's also got a very droopy tail, which is a lot more outdated compared to the way that we even saw it in The Lost World, like, a while before this had come out. And now I've heard explanations that people have given me as to why it's drooping like that, and that's because it's not being fed properly. And that's a fine explanation, but it's still something that's worth mentioning that's not really too accurate. But it does have all of the things you'd expect from a stegosaurus portrayal, like the plates, which are those osteoderms on their back, and the thagomizer, which is that collection of spikes at the end of the tail. The head and everything else seems to be pretty consistent with what we've seen before from stegosaurus in this franchise. I also want to mention the brief little cameo of the pachycephalosaurus, as they have it tranquilized on one of the monitors. Not much else I can say about it. It seems like its design is fairly consistent with the one that we see in The Lost World. So overall, pretty good. Quite like it. The Gallimimus, this is a good example of one that I don't like. The original Gallimimus was pretty good. Despite the fact that the original one lacked feathers, it had pretty much like all of the proportions and the way that it held itself done pretty well. These ones, their arms are in their arms are held a little bit too high up, and of course they fold them underneath their body instead of kind of like holding them in a more relaxed way. Their tails are poking up a little bit, and they just kind of have like an overall weird posture, as well as seemingly like more of a reduced torso. Not really the biggest fan of it. I do think that that's an example of a design that was done better in the original trilogy. But it does seem like they are still portrayed as huge, as, right next to the little tour truck right here. They're pretty darn big, and which is good because Gallimimus is the largest ornithomimid, because Deinocheirus is not an ornithomimid. Deinocheirus is an ornithomimosaur. Just want to clear that up because there's usually comments whenever I say that. The Parasaurolophus actually looks pretty good. It feels like the design remains pretty consistent with what we've seen before, which means that it still has a lot of the same problems that the original one does, and the fact that it's a lot more thin compared to the real life animal. But it does have its crest, and it actually seems to have a little bit of color, as these ones right here that are lying down have more of like a reddish pink coloration going on, which is pretty cool. So I do like that consistency. The Triceratops also remains decently consistent with what we've seen before, with the way that frill looks and the way that the skull looks and the horns and the elephant feet. Ugh. And also the long tail. It also sports more of a gray coloration as well, but it does have its beak, and the nasal horn actually does seem to be a little bit longer here. Again, it's pretty consistent. It does lack the feature scales that the original design had, which is pretty unfortunate because that is something that's accurate about the original design, and because it doesn't have it here, that kind of makes this design less accurate than a movie that came out in 1993. But it's not the end of the world. It is still a fairly decent design, but not a big fan of the Jurassic franchise version of the Triceratops. Well, of course, there are babies. A lot of these animals. They all look pretty good. They look like good representations of what babies would look like in universe. Like the Triceratops, which we've seen it before in The Lost World. The baby Gallimimus, the baby Apatosaurus. All of those fellows that we see in the sort of petting zoo. Speaking of Apatosaurus, I quite like their design. They look like classic Apatosaurus designs, which is a good approach to take, because a lot of especially if you're remaining consistent with a lot of these designs, making it look like the actual designs of the past movies, which are mostly based off of 90 like 90s reconstructions, then making an Apatosaurus look like a 90s reconstruction is a fair approach, especially with the coloration, which is a lot more dark and really reminds me of images like this that represent Brontosaurus, which is a closely related animal to Apatosaurus. The head looks good. It looks like a decent Diplodocid head. And there's obviously an animatronic that's used for this one, which is really the only practical effect that's used in the whole film in terms of like dinosaur practical effects. The rest of the dinosaurs that we see are all CGI. It looks really good, and I love that they do have something that actors can interact with. The detail is amazing, especially when it's breathing and you can see like just, parts of it moving as it's breathing in and out. Really fantastic work done on that one. And so, yeah, all around, I'd say that the Apatosaurus is a pretty decent design. Next up is the Ankylosaurus, which it has lost its like the coloration that it did have in Jurassic Park 3. Jurassic Park 3 by far has my favorite coloration with the sort of black, white, and red color scheme that it has going on. This one, it has more of a gray coloration, maybe with a little bit like small hints of green. But that's about it. The design does remain consistent with the Jurassic Park 3 one, and it gets demolished by the Indominus Rex as well. That's their lot in life in this movie. There's also the Raptor Squad, the Velociraptors. Once again, we're back talking about the Velociraptors. The Jurassic Park 3 versions, those ones are my favorites, but these ones are pretty cool. I do like the little splashes of color that they are given. Of course, we have Charlie, Delta, Blue, and Echo. As I mentioned in the many interpretations of Velociraptor video, Echo is my favorite. I love her colors. Look at that. Doesn't that look great? I love it. Obviously, Blue kind of takes center stage as the main Velociraptor, as she's the only one to survive this film. So we'll probably talk about her a little bit more as this series goes on for the next two movies. But yeah, they all look pretty good. I like the classic green coloration that you see on Charlie and Delta. And once again, Echo is my favorite. The Pteranodons. These ones are ones that I think took a little bit of a step back compared to the way that they looked in Jurassic Park 3. One positive is that they do lack teeth, which is good. Pteranodon does translate to toothless wing. But it does have a reduced crest, which is something that's reminiscent to female pteranodons, which, I mean, maybe you can see it as that, which is a pretty cool detail if that's the case. And their beaks are a little bit more curved, which is pretty reminiscent to the real-life pteranodon. But they are overall a lot more stubby and reduced in their proportions. And of course, they still do lack pycnofibers, which is something the pteranodon did have. So I'm not a big fan of their design, but their portrayal was a lot of fun, as they're like kind of attacking Main Street and even diving into the water, which I thought was a cool detail because Pteranodon was an animal that would likely do something similar to that. And then also it getting eaten by the Mosasaurus, which is also likely. I mean, we've even found Pteranodon vertebrae with shark teeth in it. So they spent some time in water, which gave them the opportunity to get eaten by sharks and things like that. So it's pretty cool to see that represented right here. I just don't really like the design. The blue ones are pretty cool, though. After that is the Dimorphodon. This one really looks like a little gremlin. Very different from its real life counterpart. It has more of a blocky skull. It's also larger, and it just looks more scary in general. It's not my favorite design in the world. It does seem like they have small amounts of fuzz, or at least judging off of this shot right here. But there's really not much else I could say about them. They took the more scary route in terms of these designs. It looks like they have like tiny T-Rex heads placed onto a little pterosaur body. I don't know. It's an interesting design. Speaking of T-Rex heads, we do have Rexy, who herself has a little bit of a redesign going on here. She is a lot thinner compared to the way she was in the original Jurassic Park, which can be explained by maybe she's not getting enough food, so there's that. She does bulk up by the time we get to Dominion anyway, and that's because they used the original model, which they probably should have done that here. But anyway, I still think that the quality of her CGI is good, and I do really like the added detail of the raptor claw marks on her neck. That was a detail that I loved then, and it's a detail that I still love now. Because just having a T-Rex here that already has history, and you can see the evidence of that history, it's just a nice little detail. And obviously, Rexy fights the Indominus Rex, the big bad of this movie, the first on-screen hybrid that we have in the franchise. I know that canonically she's not the first, but she's the first one that we see. The Indominus, I've never really disliked this design. I actually quite like it. She has these sort of interlocking teeth, a very jagged appearance, long arms with huge claws, and even like a thumb. Like she has an opposable thumb that she can grab things with. A pretty cool roar and an interesting coloration of more so like white and gray. I like her design, and I thought that the idea of having a hybrid that can fill that role of being the sort of movie monster as opposed to making the dinosaurs do that, I thought it was a good route to take, even if they didn't really commit to it in that same movie. But you know, I liked her story. I feel like we could have, like Lakota says, my buddy Lakota, I think that we probably could have taken more of a route to make this dinosaur more sympathetic, which is what it felt like they were trying to do at the beginning of the film. But it feels like they dropped that later on. That could have been a decent route to take, but you know, that's something that they didn't take. Still, I do really like her design, and like kind of diving into all of the different dinosaurs that she's made up of and other such creatures, because she's not just made up of dinosaurs. It's really fascinating stuff. So as far as hybrids go, she's probably one of my favorites. She's not my absolute favorite, but she's up there, you know. Oh yeah, and there's also a brief appearance of a Dilophosaurus as a hologram. It remains pretty consistent with the original. It does seem a little bit larger if we're assuming that this is a life-size Dilophosaurus, but still not as large as the real-life Dilophosaurus. Starting off with Sinoceratops. This is one of the first times that we actually get a different ceratopsian in a Jurassic movie, which is a pretty cool thing to do because there's a lot of really cool ceratopsians that you can implement. Now, this is not really my favorite Sinoceratops design, or really not my favorite ceratopsian design in general. Little fun fact about it, it was apparently initially supposed to be a Pachyrhinosaurus when going into this. Its skull shape is a lot more similar to Pachyrhinosaurus, like its frill shape is. It also has these little horns at the base of its frill, which is something that Pachyrhinosaurus has. The only thing that Pachyrhinosaurus didn't have is that huge horn on its nose. It actually had a boss on its nose. So this would have been a pretty bad Pachyrhinosaurus design as well. It's not a good Sinoceratops design either. Sinoceratops is completely different skeletally. Like, it has more of a wide snout with a thinner horn and a smaller frill, and it had smaller proportions in general. Not really my favorite design in the whole franchise. I do like its colors, but I just you know, in terms of ceratopsian designs, it's certainly not one of my favorites. Not a terrible design, really, but it's just not one of my favorites. After that is the Carnotaurus. Now, this is actually a pretty good design. I actually really like it because it has a lot of the traits that you'd expect from a Carnotaurus, like the abellisaurid head that is a lot more stocky, a lot more robust, very short arms, although they do have elbows. Carnotaurus did not have elbows, really. They just had what were essentially wrists, but the arms are still small. It does have the horns the Carnotaurus had, and it does have like rough skin, which is something that Carnotaurus had, but it does, you know, Carnotaurus' skin was not like in rows like how it's portrayed right here. It was more so like randomly dotted throughout the body, although that is more so a recent discovery. It's a very good design though, and like it's probably one of my favorite designs in the Jurassic World trilogy. Like, especially with this really cool close-up shot right here, you can see like every individual scale, and there's just an insane amount of detail that went into it. It's not my favorite Carnotaurus design. That one comes in the next movie, but it is a very cool Carnotaurus design. Like, I really like it. And then next up is the Baryonyx, which is one that I'm not a fan of. I've probably talked about it quite a bit before on this channel. I don't really like the Baryonyx from the Jurassic World trilogy. Baryonyx that I did like that was kind of tied to this franchise was the website design. That Baryonyx looked incredible. It had the proper like snout shape, and like the snout was properly thin. He had these huge arms with 3 huge claws, and one of the claws being significantly larger than the other ones, which is the whole reason why Baryonyx got its name, that being heavy claw. A lot of these traits are lacking in the Fallen Kingdom design, as it has more of a broad snout, claws that, like a claw that is not nearly as large as it probably should be, and a sort of crocodilian-like back, as it has osteoderms on its back. I'm not really I've mentioned this a lot before, but I'm not a big fan of just tossing osteoderms onto every single theropod that ever existed. It's more so like, to me, it feels like an attempt to just try to make them look cool and scary, when in reality, it just kind of makes them look a little bit goofy. You know, most theropods did not have osteoderms. Ceratosaurus, actually, I pointed wrong way. Ceratosaurus actually did have osteoderms. It's one of the few theropods that did, but dinosaurs like Baryonyx and other such dinosaurs, there's really no evidence of them possessing osteoderms. So I don't really like it. Colors are pretty cool though. I have seen some people do some edits of this to make it look a lot more scientifically accurate, and that paired with the colors makes it look really awesome. I'm just not I'm not a fan of its proportions and the overall shape of its skull. After that is the Allosaurus. We actually get a young Allosaurus, as in later films, installments really, we get an older Allosaurus. This one actually lacks osteoderms, as the later one has osteoderms. Yay. But this one does, like, it has more of that smooth skin texture, which is a lot more accurate, because we do actually have Allosaurus skin impressions, and it shows like an overall like smooth skin texture, kind of similar to Tyrannosaurus Rex. It also does have lacrimal crests and a very cool kind of base coloration of blue, which is a very nice contrast to that really red lacrimal crest. The shape of the skull also looks really good, and it's kind of a shame that we don't get to see too much of it, especially with an iconic dinosaur like Allosaurus. But I really do like this design. Like, even though it's a brief little cameo before it gets demolished by falling debris, it's very cool to see. Then our second Pachycephalosaurid in this franchise, or young Pachycephalosaurus, depending on how you want to view it, that being Stygimoloch. Now, of course, I'm in favor of like Dracorex and Stygimoloch being different growth stages of Pachycephalosaurus. Although with Stygimoloch, it does get a little bit more iffy because there's a chance that it lived in a slightly different time from Pachycephalosaurus. But regardless, there's still a good chance that it was in, like, at the very least, a different species of Pachycephalosaurus, if not like a younger individual. Or maybe it's an example of sexual dimorphism. There's a lot of things that we don't currently know about that. Anyway, I really like its design here. This fellow's name is Stiggy. At least, I don't know if that's its official name, but I believe many people have called it that. And it looks great. It's got that head dome. It's got these huge spikes at the back of its head. The face of the skull, wow, that's a weird way to say it. The shape of the skull looks really good. It has a beak. They gave it cheeks just like the previous Pachycephalosaurus, so they have some consistency there. The coloration looks really good, and once again, the quality of the CGI is awesome. It was also really cool to follow an herbivore be a little bit more aggressive, as that's something that you don't see too frequently in more modern depictions of herbivorous dinosaurs. So it was really nice to see it just sort of running around, taking people out with its bump on its head. It was very, very cool, and I really did like it. So yeah, it seems like they nailed practically everything that they possibly could have nailed with this one. A very good design, a design that I'm quite a big fan of. And then finally, the second hybrid that we see on screen, the Indoraptor, an incredibly underutilized dinosaur. It shows up towards the end of the film. We get some buildup for it, but unlike the Indominus Rex that had a presence throughout the whole film, it only has a presence towards like the later half of the film, and even at that, like towards the end of it, do we actually see it do anything? It's pretty cool though. It's basically like, I don't remember if this is like actually canon, but it seems like the Indominus Rex had like a base genome of T-Rex, whereas the Indoraptor, hence the name, has more so a base genome of the Velociraptor, and so it's a lot smaller, and it's a lot more agile than the Indominus Rex would have been. It also does like have like these huge claws on its feet, huge claws on its hands. It probably has opposable thumbs as well. I can't quite remember right now, and a skull that is a lot more reminiscent to the Indominus Rex's skull, just of course reduced. It also has a really cool kind of black coloration with a yellow stripe, and all around, it's just a shame that we didn't get to see more of it. Especially considering the fact that it's a lot of people's favorite hybrid, and that's for good reason. It's very interesting, and it would have been cool to see it fleshed out a little bit more in a similar way that the Indominus Rex was fleshed out. But the quality of the CGI looks really good, and even though that whole laser light thing is pretty goofy, it's just really cool to see this sort of aggressive animal on screen. Of course, Blue also has more of a presence in this film. I didn't talk about her too much in the Jurassic World installment, but she has this really cool kind of like base coloration of gray with a blue stripe. And yeah, like the other raptors that we saw in the first Jurassic World film, she looks pretty decent. There are some changes that were done to the Jurassic World version of the Velociraptor that I don't really like how far back those teeth go. For some reason, those teeth like go all the way past the eye, which is just interesting. It's a very interesting design choice that I'm not too crazy about. But Blue's cool. It's always cool to have some named dinosaurs on screen. So I want to start off with the Cretaceous Tyrannosaurus Rex, the one that Rexy was eventually cloned from, or at least that's implied. I really, really like the way that this one looks. She actually has like a small amount of feathers on top of her, which is actually likely for Tyrannosaurus Rex. Now, T-Rex is a coelurosaur dinosaur. Coelurosaurs very commonly do have feathers, and phylogenetically speaking, it's actually more likely for T-Rex to have feathers than it is for T-Rex to not have feathers. And the route that they took in this design is the most likely way that the feathers would be distributed on the animal's body, that being a very small amount of sparse hair-like feathers. It's kind of similar to how it was portrayed in Prehistoric Planet, because these are the type of feathers that are still present, but of course will not cause the animal to overheat, because of course T-Rex was a big dinosaur. It lived in a warm environment. So if it had too many feathers that were too insulating, that would cause the poor animal to overheat in a relatively quick time frame. So they did it in a very good way, and it looks really good. It's actually like really satisfying to see the Jurassic Park style T-Rex with small amounts of feathers. And it's by far my favorite T-Rex to place in Jurassic World Evolution 2. I hope it shows up in Jurassic World Evolution 3. On top of that, the modern day Rexy actually technically has a new old model, as they modeled it off of the original Jurassic Park T-Rex. So that means she has a lot of her bulk back, and it looks amazing, especially with this shot right here. The Jurassic World version of T-Rex has never looked better than she does in Dominion. She has a lot of that bulk, and for some reason, to me, the colors just look even better than they had before. So all around, the T-Rex really does win in the design department in Dominion. After that is Nasutoceratops living in the wrong time and place, which is that's the common theme with the prologue. There's a lot of animals that did not exist in this time or place, and Nasutoceratops is one of the first. Why they put Nasutoceratops instead of Triceratops, I'll never know, but here we are. Anyway, I love the way that the Jurassic World Nasutoceratops looks. Technically, it made its debut in Battle at Big Rock, which is a short film that was released like a little bit before, like a couple of years before Dominion was released. But we are just talking about the movies with this series, so, you know, both the Nasutoceratops and the Allosaurus will get covered in this video. The Nasutoceratops does look great. It has the proper Nasutoceratops head with that huge schnoz. Like, Nasutoceratops did have this huge kind of rounded snout. These horns that start growing off to the side and then start to curve forward, very similar to bull horns, which is such a cool and unique thing about Nasutoceratops, and that relatively small rounded frill. The head just looks great. It looks fantastic. There's also a male variant that has more of like a jagged nose and kind of like a larger frill and more curved and longer horns. Sexual dimorphism is always really cool to see in these animals. Of course, it's not perfect. It still does have the elephant feet. It's also a bit larger than the real life Nasutoceratops, and the tail is too long, which is pretty common for ceratopsian designs in this franchise. The baby also looks pretty good. It looks like, you know, what you'd expect a baby Nasutoceratops to look like in this franchise, with the reduced proportions, like the smaller brow horns and the smaller nose and the smaller frill and whatnot. They look pretty good, and the practical effect is also very cool. After that is the little Morris intrepidus. Now, this fella is too small compared to the real life Morris intrepidus. It's a little tyrannosauroid, and it's a very cool inclusion, like one that you probably wouldn't expect, as most people don't know about little dinosaurs like this. There is a good chance that these are just young Morris intrepidus, and, you know, it just so happens that every single Morris intrepidus we see is just a young one. But it would have been cool to see one that was a little bit larger. I mean, they weren't huge dinosaurs by any stretch of the imagination, but they were still larger than how they were portrayed in the movie. That aside, the feathering looks great. Like, I love the little kind of like crown it has on its head, and I just love how downy it looks on the rest of the body. The colors are amazing, such as with the red around its eye and the kind of black that it has on its snout, mixed in with the sort of white counter shading and the red on the tip of its tail. Very good colors. The colors are very cool, and it's just very cool to see an animal that's a little bit more obscure on the big screen. You know, you don't typically expect things like that, and I quite like when they do that. Next up is another little feathered dinosaur, you know, the Asian oviraptor, which, if we're assuming this is in North America, you know, completely wrong time and place, assuming this is 66 million years ago, which it probably is. Feathers look amazing. I know that feathers are something that's very difficult to pull off in CGI. They did such a good job with it on here, especially with those scenes in the cave where it's kind of like stereotypically going after some eggs. We now know that, you know, oviraptor does translate to egg thief, and it's very commonly believed that by most people that oviraptor spent most of its time eating eggs. That likely wasn't entirely true. It's like a huge it was a case of mistaken identity. When oviraptor was first discovered, it was thought that it was found on top of protoceratops eggs, which wasn't true, because later we found out that those were actually its own eggs, and it was actually just brooding. You know, it was, you know, it had its arms stretched out, and it was just kind of protecting its eggs. It was more so a caring parent, more so than an egg thief. So it was named oviraptor, which translates to egg thief, even though it wasn't really an egg thief. And so as a result, later depictions have always like portrayed it eating eggs, such as right here, where it eats some eggs. We also see it in a Malta scene that's, you know, was deleted from the official film, where it gets its head bitten off by a Lystrosaurus. Quite unfortunate, but the colors look really amazing on this fella. I really like the way that the crest looks. For some reason, it has like little tiny baby arms, which is just interesting. And yeah, it's a pretty good design. It's a pretty fun design, and I just love the inclusion of the feathers. I think that they did such a good job with those. After that is a very brief appearance of Iguanodon. It's not a bad design. It doesn't look exactly like an Iguanodon. Its forelimbs are a bit too small, but its head looks pretty good. The body looks pretty decent, and actually the hands, you know, despite the fact that they're a little bit too small, They do look like proper iguanodon hands with the way that they kind of have these sort of hoofs on their fingers and that huge thumb spike. It does look pretty good in that department. It does have the beak as well. Um, again, it's a out of time traveling dinosaur. It's an early Cretaceous dinosaur that presumably shows up in the late Cretaceous period in North America, even though assuming this is North America instead of Europe. So very strange overall. Colors are pretty cool. It has some nice kind of striping on it. And for a dinosaur that we've known about for such a long time, it's both interesting that it took so long for it to show up in an actual Jurassic franchise film, and B, it's interesting that it only showed up for like 2 seconds. Like it shows up very briefly in the prologue, which didn't release in the theatrical version of the film, and you can see it in the background in Biosyn Valley. That's about it, which is very interesting. I don't hate it though. I'd certainly like the Jurassic World Evolution version way more than this one. Because it has a lot of them, like it seems like it has more of the proportions down, especially with those arms. But this one's certainly not terrible. It does have a thin neck though. Much like the hadrosaurs, iguanodonts, like iguanodontids are often portrayed with like very thin necks in earlier depictions when they actually did have more beefy necks, which is certainly not shown right here. Dreadnoughtus, the Titan, like I think this is the first Titanosaur to show up in the franchise. A fitting one too. Dreadnoughtus is one of the largest Titanosaurs that we know of. It's up there with Argentinosaurus. It might be larger than Argentinosaurus, but of course we don't know for sure. That's always going to go back and forth. This looks pretty good too. The neck probably isn't held, like it's probably not held in the correct angle, but it still looks pretty good. You know, it does have like a lot of bulk in the neck. The head doesn't, it looks a little, to me, the head looks a little bit more like a diplodocid head instead of a titanosaur head, but titanosaur heads, much like this Argentinosaurus figure shows right here, they are a little bit more longer in the snout and all that good stuff. It doesn't really look that bad, you know, and it shows up in the, you know, despite the fact it was a South American dinosaur, it shows up in the prologue again, which is interesting, but regardless, it also does have the huge elephant feet that we've seen quite a bit with other like herbivorous dinosaur portrayals. It's pretty good, you know, it's pretty good. It's a brief little dinosaur that wow. It's a brief dinosaur that shows up, and it's pretty all right, you know. It's pretty all right. I definitely don't hate it, and I think it does capture some good things about titanosaurs. Now, the Parasaurolophus. We've had quite a few Parasaurolophus appear in the past. Most of them have remained pretty consistent with each other. Dominion is my favorite. Dominion is the first time that they actually go on with like a full-on remodel design, and it looks so good. It's too small. They've made it smaller for some reason. Like, look at it compared to Chris Pratt. That is way too small compared to how Parasaurolophus was in real life. It's got more, like, it's got more bulk in the neck. Overall, it has more bulk in general. The hands are a little bit more fused together and almost look like hooves, like the hoof-like structure that hadrosaurs would typically have. The tail has a lot more beef to it. And the colors look really good. The combination of the blue with the blue stripes and the more dull like base coloration, it looks really good. The head also looks really fantastic as well, and I love the way that the crest looks. This was a huge improvement on the Parasaurolophus design, and it appears in Rebirth. This is the sort of design that they're using for the unfortunately dead Parasaurolophus that we see in that. But this one is by far my favorite one that they've done, a Parasaurolophus. It was a very good redesign that I hope that we see more in the future as time goes on, because they killed it with this one. Blue was able to asexually reproduce and create a clone of herself, that being Beta. Of course, we did see Baby Blue and the other raptors in the previous film, and that pretty much matches this. The reduced proportions of a baby velociraptor in the franchise, and she has the same coloration as her cloned mother, or just her mother, I suppose, with the blue stripe and a base coloration of gray. Very cool. Microceratus also has a brief little appearance in this, and it looks all right. There's something about it does kind of seems a little bit off to me. I think it might be where those eyes are positioned. It seems like they might be a little bit too big, and they're also positioned a little bit too far up. Other than that, it's not a terrible design. It is a tiny ceratopsian, which is pretty represented right here with more of a reduced frill, and the colors are pretty cool. You know, it's cool to see a dinosaur like this that was implied to be in the franchise for a while. It's cool to see them finally appear on screen. There's a young Baryonyx that appears here, and I wanted to bring this up because it actually has like a little prosthetic limb. Like it lost one of its arms, and it's like got a prosthetic applied to it. I think that's kind of cool. And because it's younger, it actually has like smaller proportions from the adults, which means it has a thinner snout and a thinner neck, which means that it's actually technically a little bit more accurate. And so I like it way more. It still does have the osteoderms and that basic blue coloration, but all around, I think it looks better, despite the fact that it's simply just a young one. And just that prosthetic limb just really ties the like it just makes the design awesome to me. It's such a cool concept that like, well, I mean, it's a sad concept as well that implies that these animals have been fighting each other for quite a bit to the point where it's like, yeah, they got hurt, it lost its limb, let's put a prosthetic limb on it. It's pretty sad overall, but I do really like this design. I think it's a fun design, and just like looking at the design implies a lot about the actual animal's history. Lystrosaurus, which was a pretty cool addition. It's a late Permian, early Triassic dicynodont. It's a synapsid, which means that it shares far closer relation to us than it does to dinosaurs. This fellow is not a dinosaur. Again, more closely related to mammals than they are to reptiles. So they are strange little creatures. They've got like this very kind of basic bulldog-like appearance. The one in Dominion does not look nearly as weird as the actual Lystrosaurus. Like the actual Lystrosaurus has way more of like a flat snout and more of a squared off beak. But this one does have some traits that you'd expect from Lystrosaurus, like the tusks that it has, and again, the beak. A nice little touch is that they added like small amounts of hair, even gave it like little eyebrows, which is something that likely hints at its relation to mammals. So that is something that's pretty cool. It does have like a little bit of a semi-sprawled stance, which is something that Lystrosaurus did have, and a reduced tail. So they got a lot, like they got the spirit of Lystrosaurus pretty good. And it's a practical effect too. Like we see some practical effects used with this, and they look really cool. Always really cool to see a lesser known creature like this. The eyes are probably facing a little bit more forward when they're probably a little bit more on the side on the real life animal, but still pretty cool. There is also the new raptor squad known as the Atrociraptors. I don't like them. I'm not a big fan of them. I liked them a little bit more in Chaos Theory, and that's because they were given more of like a story reason to be fleshed out a little bit more. But they just, I don't know. So first of all, Atrociraptor is known from very fragmentary remains. Only a piece of the snout is known. And Atrociraptor is estimated to be a pretty small raptor, a pretty small dromaeosaur. They made them huge in this. They made like I don't know why they do that. That's something I don't like that they do. There are big dromaeosaurs in the fossil record. We have Austroraptor, we have Achillobator, we have Utahraptor, and they have not used those. Instead, they take relatively small dromaeosaurs like Atrociraptor and just scale them up. I don't think you have to do that. I think you could just use some larger dromaeosaurs. Of course, and these fellows do lack feathers, which that is very similar to the Jurassic Park velociraptors we've been seeing quite a bit of. So I guess it keeps them consistent in that, and they do have like most of them have pretty like the same coloration from each other except for Ghost. The Ghost is probably the most different from the rest of them. I just don't like the way that they look. And what's also interesting is that they hold their hands like in a way that would suggest that they have feathers on their hands, but they don't have feathers. So it just kind of looks weird the way that they hold their hands. That was an interesting detail that I noticed when I first saw the film. I just really don't understand that. But they're interesting. They're interesting designs. They're fine. I just don't like them. Now, in this movie, we do have my favorite Carnotaurus design, that being Demon. Demon, he looks so good here. Now, everything I said about the Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom Carnotaurus applies to this one as well. Has all of those classic Abelisaur traits that you would come to expect. The arms are the proper size, even though they do have elbows when Carnotaurus did not have elbows. It does have the brow horns. One of them is broken on Demon, which I love. Again, it implies that they've been fighting for quite a bit, or maybe I got that before. Who knows? There's a story that we don't know about, and I love that. It does have the rough skin, although it's not distributed properly. But the coloration is what stands out the most for me. That's what I love about Demon. That mixed in with the broken horn just looks so cool. The red coloration, which is kind of like a reference to one of the original Jurassic Park toys that has like a red coloration, a red and black coloration, just looks so cool. I just love it. I've gushed about it quite a bit, and I love it. We also see the new Allosaurus design right here, which is technically a grown Allosaurus. Still has the lacrimal crests, still has that sort of Allosaurus head shape that you'd come to expect. The whole huge Allosaurus body, longer arms with 3 claws on each hand, and they're facing the proper way too, which is really cool. And they're covered in osteoderms. I've said it a lot before. I just don't like throwing osteoderms on every single dinosaur. I don't think it's something that you need to do. Now, there is also one thing I want to mention. So there's this one scene where, of course, the Allosaurus eats the guy on the scooter. If I were to ever like win a competition or something like that to get a little like a little appearance in a Jurassic franchise movie, that's this type of appearance I would want to have. Go up for like a few seconds, get eaten by a dinosaur. That would be perfect. That would just be awesome. Just imagine that. It's like, yeah, I was in a Jurassic franchise movie. I got eaten. No biggie. That's what I'd like to, if I managed to like win a competition or something, and I got like Universal said, yeah, okay, you can have a quick little cameo or whatever, and you get to be one of the background characters that gets eaten. I'd be so happy. That'd be so fun. There are locusts, giant locusts in this movie. I don't like them. I don't know. It was an interesting route to take for the movie. They tried to take the apocalyptic route when they probably didn't need to do that. I don't know if we needed to go that route per se. They are fictional. There's really nothing in the fossil record that's quite like this. I don't know. They're fine. Like they're just basically giant grasshoppers at the end of the day. The swarm was kind of cool, but I don't know. The Quetzalcoatlus, the criminally underused pterosaur of Dominion. So it looks great. It looks really good. It's oversized, of course. It's oversized as heck, but the whole body plan looks pretty good. It's got like that huge long beak. It's got a crest on its head, which looks really cool. It's got the pycnal fibers, aka the feathers that are on its head going down to its throat all the way onto the body, and the wings look really good. This is like a really good like Jurassic version of Quetzalcoatlus that I was hoping to see more of, but of course it did get a little bit of a redesign in the new movie, and I know that there's like a story reason for that, but that doesn't mean I have to like the new design. I really liked the rebirth design. I thought it was perfect. The colors, the way that it looks, everything but the size is near perfect to Quetzalcoatlus. Pyroraptor, a lot of feathers in this movie, which is really cool. You gotta love seeing feathers. Pyroraptor is the first feathered dromaeosaur that we have in the franchise. It's also a relatively small dromaeosaur that we know of. Also, Pyroraptor is a little bit frustrating to me. It was discovered in France, right, from fragmentary remains. The problem is that there's already a dromaeosaur that was discovered in France known as Veriraptor. That's also known from fragmentary remains. Now, here's where the problem comes in. A lot of times when you find like two different animals that live in the same general area and at the same general time, you would want to have enough fossils to compare with each other to determine if they are actually separate from each other. Veriraptor and Pyroraptor, there's not enough fossils to compare. Like we haven't found the same type of fossils for Pyroraptor as we did for Veriraptor, so we can't compare to see if they're different enough. So I would not be surprised if one day in the future we determine that Pyroraptor is actually synonymous with Veriraptor, and then they used it in this movie. The feathers actually look really cool. I like the red coloration, and the way that they look on the arm looks pretty good, even though the coverage is not quite correct. Like the hands are a little bit too exposed. The hands would have been mostly covered by the feathers. It has like padded feet to help explain why it was so good at swimming. Why they made it so good at swimming in the first place, I don't know. It didn't really add too much. It's like, you probably could have got them by running straight at them, but instead you decided to go into the water for some reason. I don't know. But I appreciate the inclusion of feathers. It's just the coverage is not quite correct, especially going up to the head. But I like the little crown that it has on top of its head. Not a terrible design, and I do like it way more after the newest season of Chaos Theory. It's just there's a lot of frustrations that come with this creature, especially considering that one, we don't know how valid Pyroraptor will be in the future, and two, we don't the specimen suggests that it was a relatively small dromaeosaur and not nearly as big as they have it here. Again, just use bigger dromaeosaurs. Just use that. Austroraptor exists. Just like Lakota brought that up. And while Austroraptor was probably not semi-aquatic, Austroraptor did eat fish, so it makes a little bit more sense. It would have been cool to see. Therizinosaurus, another feathered dinosaur. They gave it sparse feathers too, which actually might be likely considering the fact that it is a larger animal that lived in a relatively warm environment. Sparse feathers might make sense. It does have the huge claws that Therizinosaurus did have, and the head is like huge and blocky. Now, we don't actually have the skull of Therizinosaurus, but we do have the skull of some of its relatives, and it didn't really look like this. The beak is not nearly as parrot-like. Wasn't as sharp. It was a little bit more flat. But that aside, the colors look amazing on this, and I just love seeing more feathers. Seeing more feathers is always really cool. A lot of times its posture is held a little bit more horizontally when it probably should be held a little bit more vertically, but still pretty cool. I love seeing it. It is a blind dinosaur. It uses echolocation to move around, which is pretty fun. And it certainly does have one of the best scenes in the whole movie. Dimetrodon, another not dinosaur, another synapsid, shares far closer relation to us than it does to dinosaurs. So I really liked their scene here too. I thought that they were utilized quite well. I loved the darkness and the light shining through the sail. Looked really cool overall. The design is not bad. You can certainly tell it's a Dimetrodon. It's got that sail on its back. It's kind of like got a semi-sprawled stance, I suppose, although it might be a little bit too sprawled for it. The head is a lot more like a T-Rex head, which is quite a bit different from the real life animal, and it kind of looks like it has osteoderms, either that or just like large bumpy skin, I suppose. I know that there's been a lot of research on the type of skin texturing that Dimetrodon might have had, and honestly, the bumpy skin might be kind of likely. I have seen a lot of art that portrays it like that. But you can certainly tell it's meant to be Dimetrodon, and I think they do a pretty good job in that department. Just the head is like one of the biggest drawbacks for it. It just really does look like a mini T-Rex head. And finally, the Giganotosaurus. This is probably the best example of how far they can go with just trying to make these guys look like monsters. It looks like a mini Godzilla mixed in with like an Acrocanthosaurus. The skull shape is quite a bit different from the actual Giganotosaurus' skull. It's a way more thin at the tip of the snout. It's got like this really interesting sort of crocodilian-esque back that leads up into a little bit of like a small hump-like structure, like an arch on his back, which is kind of similar to Concavinator, which is a small Carcharodontosaurid. Again, I just don't like putting osteoderms on everything, and the osteoderms that are present on the Giganotosaurus here certainly do make it look like a mini Godzilla. That's like the best way that I could put it. It also has like really jagged teeth, very jagged crocodilian-like teeth that I don't know. There's so many things that are just very crocodilian about this Giganotosaurus, and it's not even like you can't even say that it's been filled in with crocodilian DNA, because this is exactly how it looks like in the prologue. In the prologue, you have a real Giganotosaurus in universe. So there, I can already predict the comments that will be coming. The practical effect is very cool. I love the fact that they use that. It's very cool that they managed to use it, even though a lot about that scene was very awkward in the way that everything was kind of moving around. The colors aren't bad. I have certainly seen some better colors applied to it in Jurassic World Evolution 2, but they're not terrible here. Just that paired with the whole design is one of my least favorite designs in the whole franchise. It's really like up there with Baryonyx. I don't like it very much. I just don't like it. And there we go. Those are the dinosaurs of the Jurassic Park and World movies. Unfortunately, not the shows, because of course I didn't get to the shows in this little series, though I do plan on doing that. I do really want to look at Camp Cretaceous and Chaos Theory, maybe by season. I don't know. We'll see how that goes. Probably not by season, but But yeah, I'm very excited for Rebirth. I really do hope that this is a fantastic film. And if you stayed around long enough to get to this portion, thank you so much for watching and have an awesome day.